welcome to the Art of Terra Nil. My name is Jonathan Hau-Yoon, and I work at Free Lives in Cape Town, South Africa. That journey time is a lie. It was more like 18 hours. It's an independent game studio of approximately 25 people, of which about 16 developers are split across multiple projects. We're currently working on 3 commercial games, while also having some developers prototyping new ones. These are the games that Free Lives has successfully launched so far: Broforce, Scorn, Genital Jousting, Cricket Through the Ages, and Terra Nil. And I believe Broforce was pretty popular in France. And if you look closely at these games, you'll notice one really important thing that they all have in common, and that's that I worked on all of them. I live with my partner in a little cottage with 2 very fluffy cats. I've been working in the game industry for 14 years, mainly as a tech artist, but I've done pixel art, illustration, 3D, UI, and programming. And I also spent some time at Epic Games in North Carolina, where I worked on Fortnite. I've worked on a lot of different games and a lot of different art styles, but Terra Nil has been the first commercial game where I've done art direction, which in our case meant both figuring out the look of the game and doing art team management. Despite having worked as an artist in games for a long time, there were still a lot of things that were new to me that I had to learn when I stepped into this role. So in this talk, I'm going to be going through the history of the game and how its look evolved with the different struggles and the feedback that we encountered. I think that it's arguably more important to show the art that didn't work than the things that did, and to show the working and problem solving as well as the final solution. I'll then go into more detail about our implementation and technical breakdowns of how the visuals were constructed, and end with some of the underlying ideology that influenced how we thought about making the game. I also just want to contextualize the amount of work we did with the art team we had. Although we ramped up to 6 artists working concurrently on the game leading up to the game's launch, on average, across the 3.5 years of the project, there were 2.3 artists working on the game. So for most of the game, I was less lead artist and more just artist. Winding paths. So Terra Nil started as a Ludum Dare game jam, where Sam Alford made the initial art as part of his solo jam entry in 48 hours. It started out looking like this. The theme of the jam was Start With Nothing, and Sam wanted to make a city builder game, so the result was a game where you start with a procedurally generated wasteland and place buildings to cover it in greenery. You place various structures to help you in this task, powering your buildings with wind turbines, pumping water through your dry riverbeds, and changing the landscape with a variety of other buildings. The game did very well in the jam, placing 4th overall amongst other solo compo entries, and even placing 1st in graphics. So clearly improving upon this was going to be a tall order. The next jam game was published on itch, and over the next few months and after hours, the game saw a number of additions, including a variety of different biomes and new art, and a final tier of the game where instead of placing new buildings, you're instead tasked with recycling all of the structures you've built to create a rocket with which you blast away, leaving a pristine environment and no trace that you'd ever been there. I joined the project at around this time, spending a month or 2 working on the art and curating the music for the recycling update. The game was showing impressive numbers of both donations and downloads on itch, and with a willing team, had the potential to be continued with Free Lives as backing. So what would it take to become a fully commercial version that would appeal to players in a more mainstream storefront like Steam? Well, the pixel art had appeal, but pixel art can look rather harsh, and the screen could become quite hard to read, especially when one of our goals was to show life everywhere. The game also had a lot of text and UI, which is another area where pixel art can be a strain. So what if we looked to other sources of media about environmentalism? Studio Ghibli does masterful work in animated film at representing beautiful worlds that are full of life and has wide appeal. So what if we tried something a little more in that direction, but maybe 3D? And this was what Sam pitched to me, and he didn't have to ask twice. So this was a first exploration that used some asset packs for the vegetation. It was primarily used as a prototype for the 3D game's look and feel. There were a number of things that I liked, especially how soft the shadows felt when they were broken up by the blades of grass. It being in 3D also gave us access to other rendering trickery like ambient occlusion and other shaders that could read depth. There was also the possibility of tilting the camera as it dollies in and out. That felt pretty good. The vegetation being from an asset pack, however, did look rather noisy, and as happens with asset packs, these were generic trees and plants, and the result was that they weren't all that well suited to Terra Nil's game view. There was an opportunity here to make something new that had a more simplified level of detail while maintaining the lushness that we wanted to convey. This prototype also highlighted some other problems we would need to solve. Unlike the pixel art game, where adjacent tiles could have hard edges because of it being pixel art, the more organic look would need another way to show the transition between tiles. It had to be smooth enough not to be jarring, but also different enough for different adjacent tiles to look distinct. We explored some other Ghibli-inspired ideas, like painting the background environments as 2D sprites. These looked more promising, but would be tricky to translate into a 3D world, especially one where a perspective camera could rotate. And we also considered perhaps having line art and cel-shaded buildings as another nod to 2D animated movies. But where an animated movie may want to push its characters into the foreground, we found that the buildings would become too prominent. In Terra Nil, even though you play the game by creating structures, this is always in service of your making changes to the environment. So the environment's what players want to see, and its role is more like a main character, so it shouldn't be blended into the background. So we moved away from cel shading and kept a more subtle outline. Some YouTubers who'd created videos of Terra Nil had called it a reverse Factoria. We considered leaning into this idea. Perhaps there would be bits left behind by an old world showing how runaway, unfettered industry might have caused the downfall of this previous civilization. Perhaps we would have conveyor belts, delivery trucks, cement warehouses, or oil pipes. In contrast, the structures you build might use more natural pre-industrial materials. Instead of sterile structures that are designed to be mass-produced, we would design buildings that had individual personality, that adopted more organic shapes, and that creaked and moaned with character. I did over 100 thumbnails and really enjoyed doing these. They were a lot more whimsical than we ended up going with. Foreshadowing. We put together a diorama of the new art next to the old pixel art and showed this to our growing player base in our Discord server. The response was not the resounding positivity that we had hoped for. Although many players appreciated the overall style, which was easier to read and quite appealing, arguably the main complaint was that players had grown quite fond of some of the existing buildings, especially the iconic shape of the wind turbine. It would have been easier to pick a direction if our community showed overwhelming support for one style over another, but that wasn't the case. The tie was broken by a blog post written by one of our players, Miguel de Dios, where he discussed the itch version of the game. He wrote about how it was really important to him that the buildings in the game looked as if they were heavy machinery. It was a fallacy that individual responsibility could save us from climate change, but instead that, I quote, "It's clear that the damages we have dealt the environment can only be undone with the same strength we use to build entire societies from scratch. To restore a plundered Earth, we must employ industries, not individuals." Before then, we had liked the character in our whimsical buildings, seeing the industrial ones as being rather cold in comparison. We liked how the distinction between the two types of buildings commented on some of the potential harms of industrialization. But de Dios's post helped to emphasize an alternative point of view that was arguably more important today in terms of better embodying action against climate change. Lastly, Sam had expressed some anxiety over how long the art was taking to make. Finding a robust solution to procedurally generated cliffs had proven non-trivial, and iterations were putting strain on our team, which at the time was still only the two of us. One concession we could make was to shift from a perspective to an orthographic camera. This would allow us to paint our vegetation more as sprites rather than as 2.5D objects. Our buildings could remain 3D objects, but their UVs could be projected from the camera. And it allowed for the possibility of some shortcuts involving floating geometry to cheat some types of layering that wouldn't be possible with a perspective camera. But it would certainly feel different, and we would have to sacrifice the dolly tilt. So to summarize in this section, we prototyped several options for our art direction. We leaned into styles that emphasize the game's mechanics and themes and the emotions we wanted to convey. We explored how these would work in a functional visual prototype of the game so that we could see them in context in the game engine and make decisions using an in-game camera. We showed these to our player base, and we used feedback from teammates and colleagues and from players in our Discord server as data points to guide our decisions. All in all, these explorations took about 3 to 4 months, and although that was a significant time investment, I think the look is a big part of the game's appeal. I think this beginning period is also critical because many of the decisions we make can have a lasting impact on production throughout the rest of the game, especially in terms of how long assets take to create. How stuff works. So for vegetation, the look was something that went through quite a lot of iteration. Traditionally, in a piece of environment art, you often see images of vast, sprawling landscapes. You have a more distinct separation of foreground, midground, and background elements, and you can exaggerate this using fog. You also often have nice perspective lines, whether they're blatant or implied, and these can help you to compose your focal points. And based on those focal points, you can choose to create areas of greater and lesser detail. And these are all fairly standard ways of crafting a beautiful environmental image. Well, in Terra Nil, the game's map is procedurally generated, so we can't really choose where our focal points are. It's also orthographic, so there isn't really such a thing as perspective lines. The camera's top-down, so there isn't such a thing as depth or fog. And you can't really plan for one biome to look really good against another, because combining random generation and how players can manipulate the landscape, it's conceivable that any biome might well be seen against any other biome, with potentially hundreds of different pairings. So within a biome, if a pre-created selection of tiles is spawned, it becomes quite easy to see some repeated patterns appearing and patterns emerging, and messes with the feeling of vegetation being organic. So to solve this, we would need either a very large number of pre-created tiles or, and this is what we did, spawn the vegetation that appears on the tile randomly, inserting variation in position and scale, and in some cases, flipping the sprite horizontally. And if there's not enough variety in sprites, you also have a higher chance of seeing repeated patterns, so we would have to paint enough sprites to make this unlikely. And with enough variety of sprites and in their placements, a biome can start to look like this. There aren't any obviously repeating patterns, and I think it starts to look quite organic. But as we add more variety in sprites and tile layouts, the differences between adjacent tiles becomes more muddied. So we need enough variation that they look interesting, but still need to control this variation to try to maintain clarity. For example, a boreal forest, a tropical forest, and a deciduous forest should all look distinct from one another. This can be a difficult balance to get right, and only gets more difficult as we add more biomes to the game. It becomes critical to test the art and iterate on biomes together so that we can balance them against one another. The main game level is fully procedurally generated, and launching it in the editor spawns thousands of tiles, which takes something like 20 seconds to enter the game. So instead, we had a separate scene that held 10 by 10 tiles of biomes grouped by region, and any time we started work on a new biome, we'd spend some 20 minutes or so setting things up so that even our early sketches could be viewed in Unity as soon as possible. This made it so that any new vegetation could immediately be seen next to any existing vegetation, and we could spawn and respawn them to see countless different configurations and tweak the weighting of different sprites and repaint them as necessary. In this way, the game and its existing art somewhat formed its own art Bible, and any new art was compared with existing art for whether or not it matched in consistency. Scale in particular is a tricky thing to get right. When we look at something as vast and varied as the plant kingdom, some plants, like the elephant's ears on the left, have broad leaves with simpler silhouettes that are easy to recognize at a distance. These are the easiest to paint. Others, like bamboo trees, are characterized by long culms or branches, but their leaves are long and thin, and so although these still form recognizable shapes, it's hard to paint the thin leaves without looking very noisy or muddy at a distance. So we would tend to exaggerate the thickness and size of the bamboo leaves, and also try to clump similar details together where it seems like it can make sense. And if it still ended up looking noisy, then we'd just try to lower the contrast to make it less distracting. The clumping of similar colors is something we try to do across the board, both to avoid having to paint lots of unnecessary details and to avoid the screen looking too busy. And again, there are a lot of things that might look fine on one individual plant that look too busy when displayed together in a large clump, so it's just another reason to check things in the game. We also wanted the environment to feel alive with movement. This was predominantly done using two methods. For grasses, we would rotate each sprite around their pivot, but we'd have to combine large numbers of grass blades together into one mesh for performance reasons. And when we do this, they end up sharing the same pivots, so we just bake their pivots into their vertex color and then rotate those in a shader. For vegetation, we jiggled the pixels around a bit with a world projected noise texture that scrolled across the terrain to create the illusion of wind blowing through their leaves. We could control the strength of the offset using vertex alpha, which meant that we could have a tree's leaves jiggle while keeping their trunks static. We also needed to find a solution for blending neighboring ground tiles with one another. We briefly considered having transition meshes on top of the border between tiles with transparent blending, but this felt like it would cause problems when multiple transition meshes intersected, especially when it came to sorting issues. So this seemed like it should be a solved problem, especially with games like Age of Empires or StarCraft seeming to have vast tile sets that blended with each other. But after some time spent looking around, I couldn't seem to find an existing solution, or at least not one that was shared publicly. So what we eventually did was to create an atlas of all the ground textures that would be required in a map, During the baking process, we shrink each ground texture slightly and dilate the edges by several pixels to prevent texture bleed when a smaller level is loaded. And then we also use the lookup texture to store an index. And the index texture is a small 64 by 64 pixel texture with 1 pixel per tile. And from the index, we correct the offset for the UVs for looking up on the atlas. And this works fine in Terra Nil, where, at least so far, we haven't needed more than 16 ground textures for a map. But I think that for a game that needed more ground textures, you might need a lot smaller ground textures or a smarter way to load which textures are required. In theory, all of these tiles could share the same mesh and the same material, and the index texture being the only thing updated at runtime when the tile changed. This should have been an ideal case for something like GPU instancing of the tiles, but in practice we found much faster performance when we merged these together into larger chunks. The index texture could be projected from above onto the map, so that it was irrelevant what was happening with the mesh underneath. Whether they were individual tiles or chunks, the shader would work the same anyway. The tile meshes were easy for flat tiles, since these were just quads, but creating cliffs and riverbanks was trickier. There became a rather large number of permutations of edge pieces of various shapes, and this was rather intimidating. At some point, Sam heard about a method of using an offset grid from Oscar Stallberg. The idea is to give your visual tiles half a tile offset from your gameplay tiles. This drastically reduces the number of edge tiles you need to create, and became the solution that we adopted. Each type of grid went from needing 17 different tiles to only needing something like 5, and rounder corners could be created. This did, however, result in our visual map being half a tile too large on each side, but we solved this by putting a solid mesh on the edges of the map that was colored the same color as the background. Using the idea of an offset grid was useful for blending tiles together too. If you think about blending using the origin of a tile being the center of a gameplay tile, then you would find that you have to sample 9 different locations to calculate the blended color. But if the origin is on the corner of a gameplay tile, the number of samples required becomes only 4. So here we see the ground tile offset by half a tile. The UVs that are used to look up the index texture are dirtied up with some noise to make the transition more organic. Making animals was one area I was relatively hands-off on. Marcel Marais led the animal pipeline, making the models, texturing and rigging them, and Kane Forster did the majority of the animations. There's one particular thing I wanted to show, which is that in some cases a rig that could handle all kinds of motions would have been tricky to make. An example is parrots. When in the air, their wings are wide for flapping, but they can also land in trees and fold up their wings. So Marcel created 2 separate pairs of wings, shrinking down to one pair and swapping to the other in the transition between 2 kinds of animation. This allowed him to achieve 2 different wing states without needing to make the more complicated deformations and support geometry that may have been needed otherwise. For buildings, we tried to reference real-world industrial machinery where we could. This wasn't always possible. Sometimes the game would require mechanics that didn't have a real-world equivalent, like buildings that can turn grass into stones, into rocks. For those, we would have to do some hand-waving, but would try to make it look somewhat plausible. In the real world, many of a machine's mechanics are often hidden within containers or structures or safety equipment. So we would try to peel these back and expose them so that the internal workings could be seen from the game's view. The goal was for you to be able to guess at a building's function without reading its tooltip. It also needed to be distinct from other buildings and have a clear, readable silhouette. It had to be easy to identify when the camera was zoomed all the way out, a relatively common way to play the game. In practice, we would try to distill a building into one main function, one core representation, and build its silhouettes around it. Other parts would be much smaller and serve as interest and to add detail for when you zoomed in, but they should not obscure the main shape. They also needed animation of some kind. The pitch for Terra Nil was that it had a living world where everything but the rocks move and breathe. In its simplest form, this might be a basic effect like smoke emerging from a chimney, but some buildings were fully rigged and others had more complex effects. But ultimately, even though these were all things to consider for the art, it was most important that a building was visually interesting. While we didn't always do this, if there was a surprising way to do something so that it wasn't an obvious solution, those twists were delightful. Even if it meant that starting a fire meant reflecting sunlight off of hundreds of little mirrors and then focusing them through a lens. In the real world, a large number of structures basically boil down to cube or cylinder because these shapes are easier to build and because buildings are usually built to be ambiguous so that they can be sold and reused for different purposes. But in a game of around 50 buildings with specific purposes, trying to find varieties in shapes recognizable shapes was a necessity. The buildings were constructed in 3D, so they could have full 3D shadows, but for the vast majority of buildings, the textures were projected onto them from the game's camera angle. This allowed us to preserve the look of the painted textures as they were intended, with the side effect of saving time on avoiding doing traditional UV unwrapping. So in this case, this is the animal observatory. You can see that the texture is projected from the camera view. For most of the building, it's fine, but you can see on the side there's all this stretching, which is totally fine because we never see that. The telescope part, however, rotates around, so that had to be UV'd and textured in the more traditional way. This also meant that there wasn't exactly concept art, or rather the art that typically starts out as a number of sketches exploring some shapes and silhouettes, and it doesn't super get finalized. When we have figured out a concept that seems the most interesting, in terms of how a building would actually work, we would typically create a low-poly block-in model, which we would then draw over with some details, and then immediately put this in game with UVs projected from the camera. This would allow us to check the scale of details compared to other buildings and get a feel for how it would fit in the world using accurately modeled geometry. Without this, sometimes the concept art would result in Escher-type drawings that look reasonably good in a sketch but would break down when the model was created because drawing symmetry is hard. And so by the time the sketch became more detailed and was fully painted, it actually just ended up being the texture in the final in-game asset anyway. The top one was a building that I worked on. I don't have a pretty looking piece of concept art, but this is the calcifier's actual in-game texture and then the in-game model. And they look pretty close to the concept, but there isn't like a finished painting. Here, Jared Lunt made this building, where he rendered out a great-looking painting, and then the in-game one looks basically identical. So when Devolver Digital wanted to put together an art book, I felt really self-conscious about what we would show, because any nice-looking concept art would show would really just look identical to the in-game asset anyway, because that's how the game's art was designed. Our water was initially very strongly inspired by cel-shaded animation. The water surface is primarily scrolling normal maps that we distort with a noise texture. We then use the calculated normals to blend between two colors, which is one part of the cel shading look. And for more reflections, we sample a texture of some painted clouds, distorting our UVs with a normal map and offsetting them based on the camera's position and rotation to give the feeling of depth and parallax. We also use the normal map with a given light direction vector to create exaggerated specular highlights, just pumping the emission up really high. And this is how it looks together. And because of how big of an effect the normal map has on this look, at one point we had a normal map generated using a fluid simulation. It took like 2 seconds to generate the normal map every time you placed the building, but it looked really cool. It was just generated entirely on the CPU. But as the design of the game matured, we found that we wanted to be able to have underwater biomes like coral and kelp and animals that swim. And since objects below water were now visible, we added some scrolling textures to fake caustics. We also rendered all opaque objects into a texture and had our water read from that texture, but tinted a little bluer, and again with the UVs distorted to make them look as if they were affected by refraction. So with water now being transparent, objects that appeared below it needed to be relatively easy to see and not be obscured by distracting reflections and specular highlights. So we still kept those, but they were only visible near the edge of the screen. And since it was much more important to see objects beneath the water, we ended up getting rid of the fluid sim. It's really nice to prototype things and discard them before we did all the work of converting it into a compute shader. And I don't think any talk about Terra Nil would be complete without also talking a bit about the environmental and philosophical parts of the game. Post-apocalyptic depictions of the world dominate science fiction, and many of these views are very cynical. And although I can understand this point of view, the stories we hear about corporate greed and such are certainly depressing, but when such a large part of our imaginations is taken up by these depictions of the future, it can make this future seem inevitable. Terra Nil is technically post-apocalyptic. The world in Terra Nil starts as a lifeless wasteland, but the game gives players the agency to change things, agency we don't often feel dealing with global problems. The game doesn't prioritize amassing as much money as possible. There are no high scores, the map is not endlessly large, and you cannot expand indefinitely. Your goals are using your limited land and limited resources to balance ecosystems and animal habitats and create life. Against a backdrop where we're often told that we're past the point of no return, that recycling is ultimately pointless, that anything we can do individually is a tiny drop in the ocean against the 100 or so companies that cause 70% of global emissions. That kind of attitude is intended to inspire urgency, but for me it caused hopelessness. We're screwed anyway, so let's just continue as usual and waste as much as we want, since we'll all be dead soon. Except that's exactly the sort of attitude that guarantees that we've lost. So before I worked on Terra Nil, I was doing some art for another one of Free Lives' projects that was later shelved. That was a parody of late-stage capitalism, where corporatism ruled the world, and we had Starship Troopers-styled service guarantee citizenship, except it was something more like quarterly earnings guarantee citizenship. And I found it really difficult to work on that because I just looked around me and it felt like it was hard to parody something that seemed all too real. These are some tweets that people made after playing the Terra Nil demo back in 2021. But one in particular that hit me hard was, Terra Nil is a game about restoring ecosystems and managed to break through my antidepressants at one point and make me cry. And I think that feeling good after playing a game is much more important than it sounds. It goes much further than simply having a sense of achievement or learning something new or even simply being entertained. Most games do this really well. I think that in the context of imminent climate disaster, it's easy to get crushed by anxiety or apathy. I think it's a really good thing to create more media that exercises our imaginations and shows a hopeful future. Maybe it's only science fiction, but I think it's important to have some hopeful pieces of media in our collective imaginations. And that hopeful aesthetic is something important in our artistic choices and in our music. There are many ways to represent nature. Orcas rip the livers out of great white sharks. Vultures have their heads covered in blood as they feed on carrion. Cordyceps fungi take control of ants' bodies, but not their brains, so they can control them like puppets, while the ants might even be fully aware that their bodies are no longer their own. Nature is amazing, but the version of nature we show in Terra Nil is a sanitized one, because our main goal with it was to soothe anxiety and to create something hopeful rather than horrifying. However, I would also caution against having a grand idea and having that be the initial impetus for a game. Terra Nil didn't start off with a dissertation or a manifesto. It was a 2-day game jam. It only continued development because it did really well in Lille, and it only continued from there because other people in the studio thought it was cool and wanted to work from it. And there were a significant number of people playing the game on itch and donating money, even though the pricing was pay what you want. Having a very important message that you want to say sounds really great, but has the potential to strangle the playfulness out of making a game and put an enormous amount of pressure on you to say the exact right thing and represent all of the nuances of your cause. It's still a game, it still needs to work mechanically, and if you're going to be working on it for some number of years, it would be great if you were having fun doing it. So we released ourselves from the pressure of having to be perfect. That allowed us to be playful, to choose some visuals that brought us joy or humor rather than being particularly scientifically accurate. But we also didn't want to say that we made the world a better place because we made some depressed people on Twitter cry. It would be really nice to do something more concrete and measurable. If we were going to make a game about ecosystem restoration, then it just seemed right that we also support conservation in the real world too. So we found a local nonprofit with its headquarters in South Africa called the Endangered Wildlife Trust. They work on conserving ecosystems, protecting wildlife, and also finding ways for local communities and wildlife to coexist in a sustainable way. We pledged to donate a percentage of Terra Nil's profits to them, and to my knowledge, have given something like the second largest donation in the organization's history, totaling over 100,000 euros. That's a lot in South Africa. To end off, I want to acknowledge the artists who worked on Terra Nil, namely Marcel, Jared, Kane, Megan, Daoyi, and Sam. Each of them have their fingerprints all over the game, and I'm really proud of the work that we did together. And I believe we now have time to answer some questions.
Poof, poof. Hello?
Hello.
I'm here. Did you get? Not right here.
If you jump up, oh, there. Hello.
Yeah, you see me. Right. Okay, so my question, I guess, is a question that a lot of people have asked you, but since it's a little bit important for my community, would you claim being part, a posteriori, of solarpunk movement?
I would personally not feel very comfortable claiming that myself. I think it is amazing, but I think solarpunk has an element of being a lot more centered on like people and cities and like building our cities in a sustainable way, where for the most part I feel like Terra Nil pretends that people don't exist.
Yeah, well, actually, I would think it as a part of the taxonomy, you know?
Okay.
It's a part of solarpunk, but what is true is that the whole community find your game as one of the most representative way of doing solarpunk in video games, so...
Thank you so much.
Thanks to you, actually.
Hi, here in the middle.
Hello.
I feel bad talking about something negative after such a hopeful conclusion, but I wanted to ask if you plan to come back to these ideas around the cyberpunk, Starship Trooper dystopia that you mentioned, and also if you're okay with sharing what are the names of the cats from the beginning.
So as far as games that explore the sort of cyberpunk thing, we don't currently have a game like that in development, but we do have a game that does still explore sort of corporatism ruling the world. It's called Stick It to the Stickman. It has a version on itch that you can play. I don't know when it's coming out. But we do have a team at Free Lives that cares a lot about that message. And my cats are named Jupiter. Jupiter's the orange cat because he's big and chunky and orange. And the other cat is Tinsel. She's very silly.
Thank you. I was really interested in the animation part when you were talking about animating the grass, but it went a little too fast for me, so I was just wondering if you could go back over it one more time, please. Thank you.
So the grass specifically is animated in a shader, and what would typically happen is that this doesn't have to be in a shader where you just rotate a sprite. But when you merge a whole bunch of meshes together, that pivot gets lost. And so you need some way to restore the pivot. So we save that pivot into, it doesn't have to be vertex colors, but we weren't using vertex colors, so we save that pivot into the vertex colors. And then we read that to recover the position of the pivot, and then rotate that in a shader instead.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, so if we have no more questions, thank you for attending the conference.